So we'll start with chapter 19 of the book of Luke, starting with verse 28. And when he, Jesus, had said these things, he went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. When he drew near to Bethphage and Bethany at the mount that is called Olivet, he sent two of the disciples, saying, "Go into the village in front of you, where on entering you will find a colt tied, on which no one has ever yet sat. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, 'Why are you untying it?' you shall say this, 'The Lord has need of it.'" So those who were sent went away and found it just as he had told them. And as they were untying the colt, its owners said to them, "Why are you untying the colt?" And they said, "The Lord has need of it." And they brought it to Jesus, and throwing their cloaks on the colt, they set Jesus on it. And as he rode along, they spread their cloaks on the road. As he was drawing near, already on the way down the Mount of Olives, the whole multitude of his disciples began to rejoice and praise God with a loud voice for all the mighty works they had seen, saying, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest." And some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." He answered, "I tell you, if these were silent, the very stones would cry out." So Jesus, after a long journey, is entering the city of Jerusalem, the holy city. And he enters on a high note. Now, Luke doesn't give us this detail, but other gospel writers like Mark and John do, that while the people were celebrating Jesus entering the holy city or approaching the holy city, they were waving palm branches. Now, that symbolism would not have gone unnoticed. Simeon, about 150 years before Jesus, when he led this revolt and his army was able to storm and take back the city of Jerusalem, when they entered, he and his followers were all waving palm branches. When during the Bar Kokhba rebellion in Jerusalem, sometime after Jesus, when they were starting to become successful, they printed coins with palm branches on them as a way to claim victory. During the Feast of Sukkot, a Jewish festival, which is a festival of harvest, but it also is a festival of victory, the people will take palm branches and wave them, and that is part of their ritual. These are symbols of victory. So Jesus, riding on a colt, and his disciples are putting their cloaks before him. And although Luke doesn't say it, we know it was also happening. People were waving palm branches and saying, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace on heaven and glory to God in the highest." Like, this is a really high moment. It is a moment of victory. It is a moment of royalty. And even the people that weren't so keen on this whole Jesus thing, a particular group of Pharisees, when they come to Jesus saying, "Hey, get these guys to stop," like, it's because they knew exactly what they were proclaiming about Jesus. See, this was on the eve of Passover, and Passover was a dangerous time if you were a Roman soldier living in Jerusalem, because everyone was starting to get antsy about their overlords. And if there was ever going to be a rebellion, it was going to be then, as they were celebrating when they were slaves and God freed them. So Pontius Pilate would kind of move into town for a little bit. He'd bring a whole bunch of his cronies, and they would be watching the people. And so these Pharisees coming up to Jesus saying, "Hey, knock it off." Like, honestly, I don't fault them. I think they're actually very much getting the statement that Jesus and his disciples are making, that this is victory, the King is here, and he is arriving in the holy royal city. This is a big, high moment. It is a moment like this where we would have this sense of expectation and hope, and we would say that God is doing something. God is acting. He is moving, and it is good. But notice what comes next. In verse 41, Luke says, "And when he drew near and saw the city, he wept over it, saying, "Would that you, even you, had known on this day the things that make for peace. But now they are hidden from your eyes. For the days will come upon you when your enemies will set up a barricade around you and surround you and hem you in on every side and tear you down to the ground, you and your children within you. And they will not leave one stone upon another in you, because you did not know the time of your visitation." And he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold, saying to them, "It is written, 'My house shall be a house of prayer,' but you have made it a den of robbers." So Jesus, this person who is acting like a king, and there's a whole bunch of royal and victorious symbols kind of waving around him, quite literally. And Jesus approaches the holy city after coming down the Mount of Olives, and everyone knew that when Messiah came, he will come down the Mount of Olives and to enter the city. He views the city and he says, "But you've missed it. And because you have missed it, Roman soldiers will come in and lay you to waste." And that happens about a generation later. And then Jesus goes into the temple, the place where God's presence dwells. And he says that, "No, but your heart has grown corrupt. You've made it a den of robbers." And we know historically that it was in the middle of some very serious economic crimes. Jesus knew exactly what he was doing. And in like another chapter or two, Jesus specifically says that the temple itself, the holiest site in the world for a Jew, will also be destroyed. So think about what's happening here on this Palm Sunday. Jesus starts at a really high place. He is coming in victory into the holy city. Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. But then he approaches the city and says, "But the holy city has missed it. And because of it, there will be some very grave consequences." And the leaders of the holiest site, the place where God's presence is supposed to dwell, from Jesus' perspective, like the place where my Father lives, has grown dark and corrupt. And so now they too are under judgment. Like, how do you go from a high place of victory to a low place of loss and sadness and darkness without like injuring your neck? So, as it turns out, we as Christians will often say certain things like, God is doing something. God is on the move. God can do the unimaginable. God, in his infinite power and wisdom, can work anything for good for those who love him, to kind of sort of quote the Apostle Paul. And that's true. But when we say those kinds of things and we remind us of that truth, we often do so with a smile on our faces. Like, God can do the unimaginable. God can work miracles. God can do wonderful things. He can work in any situation. And that is all true. But I feel like if I were to just say that now, while we are all quarantined, while countless human beings have died, and now it's looking like there's going to be a lot of Americans who are going to lose their lives. We're staring down the barrel of some really uncertain economic futures as a result. A bunch of us, our lives have just been disrupted. Every day sometimes feels like more frustrating than the last. Like, there are a bunch of us, like, if we're fortunate enough to still have work, we're also now homeschooling our children, which is turning out to be legitimately challenging. Like, I reach out to people and I check in on them, ask them how they're doing, and one pattern that I've noticed is that nobody is doing well. There are people who are doing well given the circumstances, but not a ton. but most everybody is just doing okay, or they're deeply struggling. And so if I were to say, hey, but God can do unimaginable things, God in his infinite power, God can work all things for good, God can do miracles, it's like, that's great, but he's not. Or it doesn't feel like it. Or where is he? Or now, like in my case, and I know that I'm not the only one, like I'm immunocompromised. Now, if I need to go to the grocery store, I have to wear a mask. And that is weird. Like, is God really doing things? How can I take seriously that promise when we're all kind of struggling and there's no end in sight? And as much as I want a miracle, and so many of us need a miracle, no miracle is coming. We kind of go from that lofty, wonderful promise that God is capable of all kinds of amazing and unimaginable things down into the valley where we are weeping over what should be a sight of great comfort. If you can hold that tension together, then you will understand Palm Sunday in a very deep way. This combination of victory and promise and sadness and loss for Jesus and his disciples as they enter the final week of his life. Now, as we know, like as that story goes, Jesus goes and he continues to challenge the religious authority, and really it's the chief priests, the temple leadership that are responsible for getting Jesus killed. It won't be very long as we go through this Holy Week, remembering this final week of Jesus' life, where we enter into that space where Jesus eats his final meal with his disciples. And then he is betrayed, and he is tried before an unjust kangaroo court, and he is murdered by the most powerful empire in the world, where we are left wondering, what's God up to? And to drive it home, to put ourselves in this story, like, have you asked yourselves that? Like, what is God up to? Where is he? What is he doing? This is a mess. This is weird. This is frustrating and painful. And like I said, nobody is thriving. It seems that the road down from the Mount of Olives through Palm Sunday just kind of gets worse and worse and worse. And the more we read the news, it feels like things are getting worse and worse and worse. So how do we make sense of this? Well, as we know, like when Jesus goes into his grave, that's not the end of the story. Like, Jesus' heart stops beating on Good Friday and it starts beating again in some weird transformed sort of way on Easter Sunday. God raised Jesus from the dead. And that tells us a couple of things. It tells us that, first off, God actually does have power over death. Like, until this moment, death won every time. And now, death loses one. And it signals this beginning of victory, that there will come a time when God has complete and final victory over death, when we are all raised from the dead. But not yet. And so in that space in between, as we know that God really does have power over death itself, it also shows us that God works within the grit, the pain, the dryness, the messiness, the frustration, like the stuff of life. That rather than kind of enter in some like sort of weird spiritualistic sort of way, or in some philosophical kind of highfalutin kind of way, that's how we'd say it in Texas, that actually God works in the grit, into the day in, day out, balancing life, trying to figure out how to homeschool your children, which is good, and it's challenging, and trying to find work if you're now kind of wondering how you're going to make ends meet as the economy starts to struggle. Like, that God works in that, rather than acting as an escape hatch away from it. And then finally, it shows us that in God working through that grit and that darkness, that as we pass through it, then we see what God is up to this whole time. See, as you read the stories of Jesus' life and then the stories of the church after it, and especially, the book of Acts, it isn't until people are staring back at the time when God raised Jesus from the dead that they start to get it. And I find that oddly comforting. Like, I mean, I've been through it. I've been through plenty of struggles and suffering, and I know many, many people have. And one thing that I've kind of noticed is that it isn't until we've passed through it, from death into whatever the new normal, whatever new life looks like, that we start to see that God was active and working that whole time. And so I think that's a key. At least that's where we are at right now as we pass through Palm Sunday. That in order to grab like that victory and that sadness in the whiplash of just a few verses, and in order to take that tension and ask, well, what does this tension have to say for me right now? It's the reality that we are caught as we are quarantined and as the world feels like it's falling apart, before, maybe for many of us, God has really acted. And the most unimaginable and surprising thing, believe it or not, at the time when God raised Jesus from the dead, was the fact that anybody could be raised from the dead. Nobody knew that that was going to happen until it did. And so while we live in that tension of Palm Sunday, now as we are quarantined and watching this on a computer or TV screen, know the promise that if God raised Jesus from the dead, he really can do unimaginable things. But he also has a tendency to take us through them first, through the grit, through the darkness, and through the struggle. And so as we kick off Holy Week, the final week of Jesus' life, leading us to his death and through and out the other side as he walks out of his grave, may you live in that tension. May you find yourself asking, what is God up to? Knowing that we'll look back on a world that is most certainly going to be very different when this is over. And we'll see that he was active and redeeming and bringing out new life this whole time. Because between Palm Sunday and Easter Sunday, that tension gets reversed, it gets transformed into a promise unlike any other. God bless.